So this time I have a motion that council approves the agenda of session 13-2019 as circulated. Could I have a mover? Moved by Martin, seconded by Manctolo. Any discussion? All in favor? That carries. And we are going to proceed with that we adjourn the regular meeting of council and go into a public meeting to discuss the 2019 Development Charges Background Study pursuant to Section 12 of the Development Charges Act 1997, to present and obtain public input on the town's proposed development charges bylaw and underlying background study. Could I have a mover? Moved by Creelman and seconded by Nix. All in favor? That carries. So today, council is holding a public meeting under Section 12 of the Development Charges Act 1997 as amended. The purpose of the meeting is to give the public an opportunity to ask questions, provide comments, and make representations on the 2019 Development Charges Background Study. So at this time, we have a presentation by Watsons and Associates. So please come forward, and thank you for taking the time to come today. And so we, before we receive any public comments, we ask that Watson Associates Economists Ltd. do a brief presentation of the findings of the study. So if you want to put the mic on and you're all set to go.
Your Worship, just before Andrew gets going, I did have a letter on my desk. Found it yesterday when I returned. It was dated June 17th. It's from Robert and Patricia Deans. It's related to development charges. It's not related to the bylaw. It's related to payment of DCs following a fire on the property. They're beyond the 5-year statutory exemption. So I don't know if this was intended for the DCs. I haven't had a chance to respond to it. I just wanted to make you aware of it, that issue is there. So in case you have heard from
okay,
them as
so
well.
if you make a determination that it does become an issue that we have to address, would you bring it to our attention at the next meeting then?
The bylaw says, the current bylaw says if you're outside of 5 years on a fire, statutorily you're required to pay DCs. At this point in time, what this letter concludes with, since we have to move on with the building process, we will pay the fee and request an exemption and refund of the set fee. So that's the way the Development Charges Act is structured. If you've got a protest, you pay your fee, appeal it, and seek. Is correct, Andrew?
Yes, so under the development charges, there's a complaint process.
Right.
Yeah, in that regard.
So they're choosing to go that way. They're going to pay the
Okay.
fee and do the complaint process.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I just didn't know whether they'd had any contact with council.
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
Actually, they have contacted me. I'm familiar with the situation. So.
yeah. Okay, so go right ahead.
Right, thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here before council again on this matter. We had a presentation in terms of an information session with council back at the end of May on the DC, and since that time the DC background study has been formalized and released and available to the public as required under the Development Charges Act. The intent of the presentation today is, sorry, great, is that the municipality has an existing development charges bylaw, has a long history of imposing these types of charges to assist in the recovery of costs pertaining to new development and their increase in demand for services, in that helps to defray the impact on the taxpayer who has a sufficient level of service today. And the bylaw that you have that was most recently passed in August of 2014 is due to expire at the end of August unless council moves through the process of adopting a new bylaw. And so in doing so, what council is required to do is to prepare a DC background study that follows the prescribed methodology, identifies the increase in need and the associated charges, as well as the rules that would govern the bylaw. And so that's been prepared and released on the municipality's website at the end of May. The purpose of the presentation today is to hold a public meeting to summarize the background study and to allow anyone in the public to make representations to council on the matter so that you can hear from them before ultimately making the determination on that new bylaw going forward. And so the methodology that we spoke about at some length when we were here last time meeting is summarized on the next slide. And I wanted to highlight that this is the current methodology today, as we spoke about last time, and I'll update council on. There's been an amendment to the Act arising from Bill 108, the More Homes, More Choice Act. And so I'll update you and let you know how this methodology will be modified going forward. But as it currently stands today, because what we're attempting to understand is the increase in need and the corresponding capital cost of that need that relates to new development, the first step in the process is to identify what is that anticipated development. And in looking at that growth over the respective timeframes, there are a number of services that are ineligible currently under the Development Charges Act. And so this is in stark contrast to what Bill 108 will provide for. So the way the Act is currently structured today is that there are certain services that are deemed to be ineligible. And those services include cultural and entertainment facilities, tourism facilities, the acquisition of parkland, if you were going to make contributions towards a public hospital, administrative facility space for town hall, and costs related to incineration and landfill of solid waste. But other than those ineligible services under the Act, any other service where you would have an increase in need for increase in demand for service from growth, you could include potentially in a DC. Under Bill 108, that changes the focus, where now there's only certain services that will be permitted. So under Bill 108, when those sections come into effect as we're awaiting regulation, going forward, DCs will only be allowed to be used for what is commonly referred to as hard services, meaning costs related to water, wastewater, and storm, costs related to roads and the related public works of maintaining roads, transit, fire, police, solid waste management with respect to waste diversion. Those are going to be the only permissible services. So right now under your bylaw, where you have charges related to parks and recreation and library, for example, those will no longer be permitted services when Bill 108 is fully proclaimed, right? What the province is doing in replacement of that is to provide you with the authority to impose those charges under something referred to as a community benefits charge, right? Which we'll speak about in a minute. So that's a pretty significant change in the methodology that doesn't apply to this bylaw, but will apply once that section is proclaimed, as we anticipate to be in 2020. Once we've determined then what services are eligible, we then need to look at the increase in need for services and the associated capital costs. We have to measure those capital costs relative to the historic level of service that you've provided. So you'll see those details in Appendix B of the background study, which summarizes those calculations. And then in Chapter 5 of the background study, you'll see the specific capital projects that underlie the needs for each of those services that are expected to occur over the 10-year forecast period. And in looking at those costs, there's then a number of deductions we have to have consideration for. So is there oversizing in those costs that will benefit growth beyond the 10-year forecast period? If there is, that needs to be deducted as a post-period benefit. If there's a benefit to the existing community because we're replacing infrastructure as a result of providing for the increase in need, that needs to be deducted as a benefit to existing, for example. Under the current act, the soft services like parks, recreation, and library have a further 10% statutory deduction that has to be considered. Once those have all been accounted for, that then provides us with the net capital costs over the 10-year period that you can use DC revenues to fund. And so what will happen is when these charges are imposed, those monies will be contributed into a reserve fund for those services. When those projects come forward as part of council's capital budget, those reserve funds will provide a source of funds to offset some of those costs, and that they'll be paid for by development charges. And so that's generally the process that we have to follow, and that's described in detail in the background study. What you also see in the presentation is an update on Bill 108. So as we referred to earlier, the legislature had introduced the bill on May 2nd. When I was here last, it was being referred to committee at that point. It later received royal assent on June 6th. And so while the act has received royal assent, there's very few sections of that act that are actually in force today. The majority of that will come into effect when we receive regulation from the Lieutenant Governor. So what that means at the moment is that municipalities can continue to impose DCs under the current regime, allowing you to impose charges for soft services like parks, recreation, and library, and to continue on that basis for a period of time to allow you to then transition into the new regime that will remove those soft services from the DC bylaw and allow you to recover those costs through a separate bylaw of community benefit charges under the Planning Act authority. And so one of the notable changes in the regime is that while the soft services will now be governed by community benefits charges, instead of being imposed at the time of building permit issuance based on the type of development that would be in the building permit, those will be imposed based on the underlying value of land at the time that the building permit is issued. So it will act more like your parkland dedication fees do today, where it'll be a prescribed percentage of land value that will allow you to recover those costs and, again, contribute those into a reserve fund for those soft services. One of the things that's worth noting, though, is that in preparing that bylaw, like a DC, you'll have to prepare a background study, which they refer to as a community benefits strategy, to determine what your rate would be for those charges. But the minister can also prescribe a maximum rate.
And where do we get the underlying value of the land from? Is that an impact number, or?
That will be something that the municipality will determine in terms of how that valuation is undertaken. Some municipalities will use impact valuation, for example. I think what will be interesting is, so if you think about it conceptually, what the municipality would presumably be entitled to do is to take the costs that you would be entitled to under this DC bylaw for parks, recreation, and library, move that into this realm of the Planning Act and impose it under a community benefits charge. And so those costs, you would divide it by the presumed forecast value of the land, let's assume using impact valuation, right? And let's assume for illustration purposes that produces a charge of 8% of land value. If the province, with their powers being able to prescribe a maximum rate, limit that to say 5%, then you have a potential funding implication.
Is it okay if I? So would this community benefit charge occur every time there was a land transaction, or only when there was development on a piece of land?
Only when there's development. So at the time of the building permit issuance, so as it would occur today, so there's development of the land, you issue the building permit to allow them to construct on the land. That's when you would impose a DC. But under DC regime, if the building permit was for a single family home, you would apply a single family rate or charge. What presumably would occur under the community benefits charge is that you would look at the underlying value of that land at that time and then apply this 8% rate or 5% rate that you would calculate through the community benefits strategy. So there's obviously, we're still awaiting regulation to determine the details of that in terms of, are there going to be any limitations in terms of services that can be considered community benefits, and the process of calculating those charges. I think if municipalities are confronted with the fact that there might be a limitation in terms of the rate that can be imposed that may not reflect your needs. So like I mentioned earlier, if you were calculating the need for a rate of 8%, but you may be limited to 5%, then what strategically municipalities might be doing is looking at, well, how do we appropriately value that land to maximize that 5% rate, right? So now that your cost side of the equation would be somewhat limited in terms of establishing the rate, how you implement that rate to maximize the value of land that you're using as a charging parameter might become more strategic. And that's why I was sort of answering your question earlier. I'm not quite sure if that will be limited to your impact valuation, whether or not you will have land appraisers who will undertake that work more regularly to make sure that it is more reflective of current land values, because sometimes impact valuations can be a little lagging market rates, for example. So there's a lot of unknown yet, but we'll as the regulation comes forward, we'll have more clarity on that. So in addition to this, so the community benefits piece is obviously the biggest component of the change. The other is that, as I mentioned earlier, under your DC bylaw today and under the Act today, most municipalities are imposing development charges at the time of building permit issuance. Those rules will change as well. And so under the Act, under Bill 108, when this section becomes proclaimed, if somebody is developing and they're doing so as a result of a planning application that is either a site plan approval or a zoning bylaw amendment, the charges that they will pay will in essence be grandfathered or locked in at the time that the planning application is made. So for example, if you had somebody who was developing a parcel of land and they had to come forward with a zoning bylaw amendment to allow development of that land to occur. And let's assume that that happened in 2020, for example. But they didn't subsequently develop that land and reach the point of a building permit issuance on that land until 2022. The rates that they would pay in 2022 would have been locked in at the rates that were imposed when they made the bylaw, the zoning bylaw application in 2020. Right? So under the proposed regulation, if a development's coming forward through a site plan approval or zoning bylaw amendment, it would appear that they would have up to 2 years after the approval of that planning application to then subsequently develop that land and either trigger the issuance of the building permit or the occupancy of the building permit to maintain those prior rates.
Just following up on that, and I gather now I gather now that the commercial industrial DCs can be phased over a period of time. Is it 3-4 years?
Yeah, so that's the other item. So in addition to, in essence, locking in those rates, if you're proceeding through site plan or zoning bylaw, if you're developing rental housing, certain types of commercial development, industrial development, or institutional development, whereby today you would pay those charges at the time of building permit issuance, under Bill 108, you will pay those charges over 5 years. So it'll be a six installment payment, the first installment being required at the time of occupancy of those units, so a bit delayed from the time of building permit issuance. And then you will only recover 1/6 of the charge at that point in time. The subsequent installments will be paid each year thereafter.
Here's my concern, and that is that, say it's a commercial enterprise, leaving aside the rental housing. Say it's a commercial enterprise, and they aren't around after year 2 or year 3, and we're left holding the bag because we've only collected a portion of the eligible development charge. Is there anything to prevent a municipality from requiring a letter of credit to guarantee performance on payment of the full development charge in the event the business is no longer a business?
And that's a good question. So it doesn't appear that they will, firstly, it appears that this will be a standard practice. And so municipalities will not be entitled to require a letter of credit, right? What you will be entitled to do is charge interest on the installments. It doesn't appear that the minister is going to prescribe a maximum interest rate, so the town would be able to establish what that interest rate would be. And then if that was to occur, if those situations were to occur where you would not be able to collect those charges, then the recourse that the town would have is to apply that to the tax bill and collect it as taxes on the property, right? So worst case scenario, presumably in that case, is that it would become a lien on the property and it would subsequently be recovered through that tax obligation in the future.
And in the event of a bankruptcy, what standing would the town have in terms of priority payout?
Yeah, so my understanding, and I don't know if Les might be a bit better to inform this, but it's my understanding that those charges have priority lien status. And so in the sequence of creditors, the municipality would have a pretty top priority in that respect. Okay, so those are the changes in terms of how the charges will be calculated for certain types and then how they'll be imposed on certain types. In addition to the 6-year installment that I mentioned for rental housing and ICI, if you were imposing development charges on not-for-profit housing, they would be entitled to a 21 installment payment. So it would be paid over 20 years in that regard. Which in part begs the question why anyone would even bother, quite frankly. But so those are the changes that have been identified but not yet in effect. As you can see in this slide, Schedule 3, which is the amendments under Bill 108 that apply to the Development Charges Act, the last 3 bullets are the only sections that are currently in effect today. And so the amendments that are in effect with respect to Section 1 and subsection 3.4 of Bill 108 are simply just to clarify definitions of waste diversion and policing. Also, the items at the bottom related to subsection 13.5, subsections 14 and 15 are more housekeeping matters that allow the Lieutenant Governor to prescribe regulation and also make amendments to other legislation. The one that is notable is this subsection 5.1, which speaks to how will municipalities transition from the current DC regime to this community benefit charge regime. And so what that section provides for is it introduces this new section 9.1 sub 1. And what that says is that if you have an existing bylaw today, that you can continue to impose the soft services under that bylaw. So your bylaw today, which has soft services for parks and recreation and library, you'll be entitled to continue to impose those charges until the earlier of a prescribed date. And based on the draft regulation, that prescribed date would appear to be January 1st, 2021, or the date that you put into effect or the date that you pass a community benefits charge bylaw. So,
And that, this transition period, that wouldn't, suppose we already have reserves under our current bylaw, but we haven't used all that money up by whatever this date is. It's not going to impose any, I mean, we can still use it after that
yes.
date.
Yeah, so what will happen is, so simply what this means is that you can continue to charge soft services. You can continue to adopt this bylaw with those soft services in that bylaw. And those charges will continue on, but by January 1st, 2021, you will have had to adopt a new community benefits charge bylaw to continue to charge for those soft services. And when you do that, it will amend this 2019 bylaw to remove those soft services so you're not double collecting in that regard. And to the councillor's point, what will also happen is the reserve funds that you have at that point in time for Parks and Recreation and Library will transfer over to the Community Benefits Charges bylaw at that point in time. So it'll function very similarly. It'll allow for the transition to occur in that regard. So that's an update in terms of where things are at. The regulation has been posted on the province's website for comment. The comment period ends, I believe, the end of August. So we would expect to probably see regulations in the fall, and then this transition period to commence January 1st of 2020 and through the year of 2020 to allow municipalities to make that transition. So then with respect to this bylaw for council's consideration, as you'll see identified in the DC background study, we've identified the anticipated development, which is consistent with the official plan projections to 2036. One thing you'll note in the study is that we've limited the forecast period for all services to this 10-year period of 2029. And what that's reflective of is your available land supply in our discussions with planning in terms of the amount of growth that can be accommodated, and therefore the needs associated with that growth. And so what we've looked at is approximately just over 4% population and employment growth occurring in the town over that period. So that would see an additional 234 residential units being developed over that time, and about 58,000 square feet of additional non-residential floor space being constructed to meet those projections. And then in terms of the needs, in Chapter 5 of the background study, you'll see for each of these services, which is maintaining the same services that you have today, the various projects that have been identified, which we went through with council when I was here at the end of May, and the share of those costs that could be attributable to development and included in the calculation of the charge. And when you look at those tables in summary, what you would see is that the gross capital cost of all of those projects total approximately $20 million. And when we look at those needs and the various deductions, what we see is about 39.5%, or approximately 40% of that is either DC eligible today or will be in the future. And where we see that reflected is that you currently have about a little over $4 million currently in your DC reserve funds to meet some of those obligations. There's about $500,000 in costs related to parks and recreation and fire that will benefit growth beyond the 10-year period that's been deferred, and so that will come in place in a future DC bylaw as your growth continues to expand, or in your community benefits charge. And so what that leaves is approximately $3.2 million that's looking to be recovered from this bylaw, or over the 10-year period of which this bylaw would impose those charges. And so when we look at that $3.2 million that underlies the charge, what we see, and this is fairly common in most municipalities, is that the majority of those costs are for hard services. And so transportation services account for about 75% of the total. So the costs that we've identified for improvements to the road, for signalization costs, for widening of bridges, additional vehicles and equipment to maintain those roads is largely what these charges are being imposed to recover in that regard. Yep. Yeah, so these are, yeah, so these needs are for the 10-year forecast period for all of them. This bylaw, however, will only has a 5-year term, right? So what will happen is these are the needs for the next 10 years that inform what those average charges should be. 5 years from now, you'll be reviewing this again to see if those charges are still sufficient or whether those need to be further adjusted because the costs have changed.
There was you said something about parks, but I didn't quite follow it. Parks, something being extended into the next 10 years.
Yeah, and so with respect to the costs in the DC background study that pertain to parks and to fire, because we have this historic level of service measurement that we have to undertake, what that does is it says, for example, you've invested a certain amount on a per capita basis over the last 10 years. That limits you, for the purpose of this bylaw, to no more than that amount. The capital costs that we've identified for Parks and Rec and for fire exceed those by about $500,000, those limits. So what that says to us is that because those costs cannot be included in this bylaw, that would suggest to us that some of those needs will have benefits for growth beyond the 10-year forecast period. So it's more a reflection of those capital needs being oversized, that they will have capacity to serve growth beyond the 10-year period. And so we're just identifying that for the purpose of this DC, so that when you come forward in your next DC, and then you're looking at a forecast period that will extend another 5 years, you would be able to recover those costs at that point in time. So it's just a recognition that they are growth related in nature, that they should be paid for either by a future DC or a community benefits charge now, And this is just earmarking those amounts to say they should be, continue to be recovered from that mechanism and not paid for by taxes. So in looking at those costs then, of 3.2 million over the respective development, that provides us with this schedule of charges. And so you can see the charges are delineated by service, as we mentioned earlier, roads being the largest component of those services. The charges are also differentiated by built form. So if it's a single detached home as compared to a bachelor apartment, the rates reflect the underlying occupancy exhibited in those units so that there's equity between the demand for service based on the type of unit being constructed. And so how we see that reflected is that if it was a single and semi-detached unit that was being built, the charge would be $11,854 per unit. If it was a bachelor or one-bedroom apartment, that charge would be lower. It'd be $3,884, reflective of that occupancy. If there was a charge for non-residential, that being commercial, industrial, or institutional, that charge would be $6.52 per square foot of the floor area being built.
I have a question, or a couple of questions regarding the non-residential 652. I think it's fairly straightforward if we get an application for a commercial building that complies with zoning and we approve it, that the development charge is collected. What is less clear to me is a situation where a structure that has existed for some time changes use, and it could have started life as a agricultural structure of some sort, or it could have started life as a large storage facility or something of that nature, and suddenly we are faced with a zoning application to change that use to something that is arguably covered by the definition in the bylaw for commercial or industrial purposes. Are we entitled to, upon approval of zoning, the zoning change to collect development charges on that structure and at the rate of $6.52 per square foot?
Yes, so there's a number of triggers in the Development Charges Act that would allow you to impose a development charge. And so what we need to be able to identify is that, for example, if you have a change in use, and if that was to require a change of use permit, as an example, right, then the DC bylaw would come into effect. So what would happen, for example, let's assume somebody had an agricultural storage facility, and the change of use was converting that to a commercial facility. Even if there was no additional gross floor area identified, it was just a straight conversion, let's assume, for the purpose of illustration. Then what would happen is that the change in use would then identify that as being commercial. Because that is a change of use permit that's being identified, the building permit would be assessed, or the DC would be assessed, and it would calculate the charge at $6.52 a square foot. Then under your Development Charges Act, under your Development Charges Bylaw, you also have a redevelopment credit, which says if you have an existing use today, and you're converting it or demolishing it and replacing it, then you would be entitled to a credit based on what had been demolished or converted before. In this example, because an agricultural building would be exempt from DC payment, there would be no DC credit provided because there was no DC paid initially on that facility, and so the difference would be payable, right? If, another example being, let's assume it was an industrial building that, say, converted to a fitness center, as an example. That would be an example of it converting from an industrial to a commercial use. Because both industrial and commercial would be payable, then there would be an offsetting credit and no DC would be paid, if that makes sense.
Sorry, I just didn't quite understand your last point. And it's John's question, but I got a little lost.
Yeah, so in terms of the last point, so the key is that So the redevelopment credit is designed such that we're trying to identify that with a redevelopment activity, what is the incremental amount of demand that's being required, right? So a simple example of that would be, somebody has a single-family home, they demolish it, and they're going to rebuild a 6-unit townhouse, right? You would, when it came through the DC process, you would calculate the DC for the 6-unit townhouse. They would be entitled to a credit for the single-family home that had been demolished as a result, and they would pay the difference in charge.
So I got that,
Yeah.
it's the switch from a factory to a health.
Right.
They're both 652 a square foot.
Right, so the difference being that, so that credit applies basically uniformly, right?
But there would be no credit. I mean, say it's 1,000 square foot factory,
Yep,
and you come in and switch it to 1,000 square foot
right.
health club.
There'd be an offsetting credit and the charge would be zero,
Yeah, okay.
right? The difference with the agricultural example that I mentioned earlier
Yeah, is going to,
is that if what was demolished or converted is exempt under your bylaw, right? So if it's an agricultural use, for example, right? There would be no DC credit because no DC would be calculated on an agricultural use. So if that's clear in terms of the conversion.
And to follow up, and I have a subset question, as it were, to follow up, at what stage is the DC payable? Is it payable upon issuance of the building permit, presuming that the zoning has been approved for change? Or in a situation where somebody simply changes the use and doesn't go through a zoning application, or there's a delay in that, does the DC, are we entitled to collect the DC upon the change of use?
Yeah, so again, if it triggers a building permit under the building code for a change of use or for construction or whatever it may be, when that permit is issued is when that charge would be imposed.
Just to the issue of, and Mark has referred to a letter that we've received, and this goes, I think, to the issue of exemptions. A house burns down, and the owner of the property, the now owner of the property, wishes to reconstruct, but is outside the 5-year period. Is it not double dipping to charge a DC when there may have been a DC already collected on that property for the building that was destroyed by fire?
Yeah, so again, the same, so we're in essence talking about the same policy, and this is these redevelopment credits, right? And so what you'll commonly see in redevelopment credits, as you see here, is the municipality will continue to provide that credit for a specified period of time. In a lot of cases, that specified period of time will range from 3 to 5 years. The rationale for why there would be a limitation, right? So on one hand, you could say, it doesn't matter that I had a home if it built down, if it was demolished 20 years ago. I'm simply replacing that 20 years later. There's no presumed incremental demand beyond what was there 20 years ago. Maybe a DC was paid 20 years ago, therefore they should be exempt from payment, right? The reason why, and there are some, very few, but there are some municipalities that don't have a time limit, right? So it's just open-ended. If you can substantiate that you demolished something, whether by fire or otherwise, you would be entitled to a credit. The reason why most municipalities will limit that to a 5-year period is because every 5 years, at a minimum, you are looking at this DC bylaw. And every 5 years, you're assessing your current development today that exists, their demand for service, and the vacant lands and their demand for service to calculate this DC. And so if you've had a property that has been vacant for 20 years, are they still entitled? Are you still reserving service capacity for that vacant land for its subsequent redevelopment, and how long will you hold that vacant capacity for, right? And so that's typically why municipalities every 5 years will reset this redevelopment credit, if that makes sense.
I didn't intend to get into the merits of this particular situation, but with you here, I wanted to find out what the rationale was, so
Yeah.
that when we do consider it, we have that background. Thank you.
Yeah. And so that is the rationale. And so we'll highlight that as part of this presentation today. And again, you know, council, because that is not a statutory policy, and what council can decide to do is to, you know, potentially have changes to it, right? So if we were saying that you are going to witness these credits for a 5-year period, you could have an exclusion in there that says if it's being demolished as a result of fire, that there is no limitation, for example, right? So council, or you could say they'll have 10 years, for example. So council has flexibility, just to highlight through this process, that if you wanted to make those kinds of accommodations within that policy, you have the discretion to do that.
Does that have to be in the bylaw at the time we pass the bylaw, or do we have that discretionary power once the bylaw is passed?
Again, so it should be reflected in the bylaw.
Should be.
Yes, and so because I think, you know, the one thing to be cognizant of is that if you are potentially waiving a fee on development, we want to make sure we have very clear rules as to how that might apply, so that you're not in contravention of bonusing under the Municipal Act, right? So that's why I think it's always preferential to have those rules laid out, so there's pretty clear groundwork in that regard.
Andrew, if you're moving out beyond the 5-year period, though, you no longer have apples and apples within the bylaw, right? You don't have a residential charge here. You have a residential charge that may have been paid 20 years ago. Should the bylaw then reflect that if you're going to give credit on an older charge that is not related to the 2019 bylaw, is based on the charge that was paid at the day of the building permit originally? Is that going to go beyond the act?
Yeah, so again, there's nothing necessarily preventing the municipality from doing that, because again, this is a discretionary policy. Most municipalities wouldn't do that, because what you're attempting to do is it's more of a recognition of this service capacity that's being replaced. And so obviously, this service capacity for roads, or the value of that capacity for roads 20 years ago, compared to what it might be today, would be a lot less, even if it was nothing more than indexing, right? And so that's why typically what it's an acknowledgement of is that, again, for example, I'm demolishing a property. I had a sufficient amount of road capacity allocated to that property. I'm now replacing that, and the recognition or the valuation of that capacity today is what's in the bylaw for that rate, if that makes sense. So again, back to the presentation. So that's the schedule of charges that are being proposed and considered in the background study. This is a comparison of those charges relative to the existing charges today. And so we see that for a single detached residential unit, the charge would increase by about $1,500 per unit. What that's largely reflective of is the additional costs for the provision of library space and collection materials through arrangements with Shelburne and in contributions towards that service, and the increase in costs related to Parks and Rec in terms of the program that's identified compared to what it was in the prior bylaw. When we look at the non-residential charge, we see that increasing from $4.06 a square foot to about $6.52 a square foot, based on the increase in need. And when we look at that a bit broader, what we've included is a comparison of charges for the surrounding area municipalities. What we've included in here is not only the charges for the lower tier municipality, but also reflecting the county's charges or the upper tier charges that are applicable in Caledon. Also, the Board of Education can levy charges for additional land required for school purposes. And so when we look at that increase, what that would see is that your position would move closer to the charges that we see today in Orangeville, representing about a 10% overall increase. in that the town represents about 73% of the total DC charge that would be levied in your jurisdiction on this type of unit. The other thing worth noting is that there are a number of municipalities in here that are like yourselves going through this same process. And so when we look at Orangeville's charges today, what is currently being proposed for them is that they're going to stay relatively where they are. There's a slight decrease being proposed in their charge, but they're going to generally keep their same relative position. The charges in East Garifraxa are going to stay roughly where they are. Amaranth are decreasing about $2,000 a unit approximately for their charges. Grand Valley would be increasing quite significantly from where they are, much more closer to the charges in Shelburne for School Road, so moving them closer to the upper end of that spectrum, just to give you an idea of some of the relative changes we're seeing in some of the other municipalities as well.
The fact that the upper tier charges are so much higher in Caledon and Simcoe County, and maybe you can't answer this, I mean, is that suggesting that those upper tier governments are providing a greater level of service than our Dufferin County is, or?
Yeah, well, the big driver in those for region appeal is water and sewer, right? And so it's the big costs of water and wastewater that are being imposed through their DC that have such a stark contrast compared to what you see here in the municipalities in this county.
And what about Simcoe County? Do you have any idea why they're just ballparking? They have to be more than double what Dufferin's DCs are.
Yeah, and so again, just based on, I can't speak specifically to what their specific needs are that are reflected in there. Largely, I would expect that would be their road costs relative to the Dufferin County roads. That may show what that difference may be, but I'm not quite as informed with respect to Simcoe in terms of that comparison.
Just to be clear, these bar graphs are related to proposed development charges.
So these are
or current.
These are the current, and what this is showing is your current relative to the proposed. And if council likes, what we could do is we could, if it would be helpful to you, we could send you a copy of this that would also show the proposed charges for Orangeville and Amaranth and Grand Valley as well, so you can see how they're proposed to change under their background studies as well, if that's helpful.
And I believe there's a little bit of apples and oranges here to the extent that Orangeville doesn't charge for commercial industrial or industrial.
Yeah, so you'll see that in this. So this is a comparison of single detached charges.
Pardon me, yes.
Yeah. We've also included in here a comparison of the commercial charges. So what you see here, again, reflecting your change, that would see the charges increase by approximately 50% in total. What you also see, though, is that in Amaranth and East Garifraxa, while they have lower tier charges for residential, they completely exempt all non-residential from payment of DCs. And then further to your point, when you start to drill down into industrial, when we look at the right-hand side, what we also see is that in addition to Amaranth and East Garifraxa, also Grand Valley and Orangeville currently exempt industrial from the payment. So in Orangeville and industrial, they would charge it on commercial and institutional uses, but not industrial uses. Again, one point of note is that with respect to Grand Valley is under their current bylaw that's coming forward to council for adoption, it's proposed that exemption would be removed. So they would start to charge for industrial as well as commercial.
Has anyone ever done a cost benefit as to the value of that exemption relative to what you're able to attract by way of investment?
Yeah, it's quite a debated topic. I think, so firstly, I think the reason why you see some municipalities exempting industrial as compared to commercial is firstly because when you look at some of the considerations of commercial development or population-related employment development compared to industrial, is that if I'm building a service commercial business, What I'm primarily concerned with is proximity to the population market that I'm going to service, right? And so if there's a lot of population growth expected to occur in the town, I need to be relatively close to that population growth. Me moving to a municipality that might be a 10, 15-minute drive away because they have no DCs may not be necessarily beneficial to me. But if I'm industrial development, my sensitivities are not so localized, right? What I'm more concerned about is there available service land? What's proximity to major transportation networks? What is my proximity to an employment market, right? That may have a tendency to commute up to 30 minutes to my place of employment, for example. So now their geographic area of consideration might be a bit bigger, and they might give consideration to things like DCs, for example. But some of the literature we've looked at, when you start to rank the considerations for industrial, is that those types of fees and charges are relatively low in terms of the ranking of priority in those considerations. And the other thing to bear in mind too, if you're an industrial property owner, you're paying a higher tax rate based on tax ratio policy. And so you may be more inclined to want to pay those charges through DCs, capitalize them through your project, and amortize those, as opposed to the municipality maybe having higher relative tax rates that are going to be a consistent ongoing tax to your business going forward.
Strikes me that the exemption is a form of bonusing by another name.
So interestingly, it's one of the areas that you can provide those incentives without it being bonusing. But the key, and this is why it's key always when we have these discussions with council through DCs, is that we need to make sure that we have a very clear rule that establishes how you're going to provide those exemptions so that you're not in violation of bonusing. Right.
The increase in residential is, from the current, is about 15%, and for non-residential, about 60%. Can you tease out why there's such
Differences.
a big increase with non-residential?
Yeah, and yeah, a good question. So when we're looking at the needs that have been identified and the share of those costs that would be DC recoverable, under the Act, what we also have to do is then apportion those costs based on the growth that was identified in the first case, the growth forecast. And so when we look at the change in the makeup of residential to non-residential growth in this DC bylaw compared to the one prior, it's allocating more cost to non-residential, right? Which is seeing more of that cost being borne in that charge relative to what was identified before, right? And so where you see that sometimes in municipalities is as municipalities move closer to building out their residential supply, sometimes what happens is your non-residential development lags residential growth, right? So as we mentioned earlier, your commercial development may occur later than your residential development because they're waiting for those population markets to occur to create opportunities for service commercial, as an example, right? What we've also seen in municipalities is industrial is really lagged, right? Because of broader economic forces. And so what ends up happening is as you start to build out your land supply, is that weighting of future growth changes from more of a balance of res to non-res to shifting more of those costs to non-residential because you're building out more of your res supply and your non-res supply is remaining constant and will lag, if that makes sense.
So that it's mostly in transportation, I guess, in roads.
Exactly, because those costs are being apportioned based on this next 10 years and that relative share of population to employment.
Okay.
So that provides you with the calculations and the comparisons. In terms of the policies then that underlie the bylaw, the charges are encompassed in one bylaw. They're imposed on a municipal-wide basis, meaning irrespective of where the growth occurs in the town, the rates would be the same, which is a fairly common practice and reflective of your current and historic practice in that regard. The charges are imposed at the time of building permit issuance. And so even though they are imposed at the time of building permit issuance, council also has the ability to enter into agreements with developers to either have them accelerate payments in advance of that timing or potentially defer them. And that's an example for the councilor's question earlier, where you could require letters of credit, right? So in contrast to Bill 108, where that will be a mandatory payment requirement, where you're deviating from your payment requirement, say for residential, to allow them to pay later, either at occupancy or a period after building permit issuance, then you would be able to build into that agreement those types of conditions on credit arrangements, for example, or letters of credit. In addition to the charges you've seen that you've seen identified here, the municipality has a practice of indexing these charges annually. The reason for that is so that they keep pace with inflation over time.
And what do we use to index it?
The Act requires that you use the StatsCan Construction Price Statistics Index. And so it's not the CPI index, it's this construction index, and you would use that, and that's produced quarterly.
It's actually quite generous by comparison to typical indexes. as I
Yeah,
recall.
it's averaged about 3% over the last 5 years. Most recently, I think last year was around 5%.
Correct.
Yeah. But interestingly enough, even though it's higher than CPI, the fact that we still see DCs increasing every 5 years is really more indicative of the fact that it's not even reflective of what the municipality's costs are increasing by. So it would suggest your costs are increasing even greater than that. And so then in terms of the exemption from payments, so there are some statutory exemptions that are required. So any municipality that has a DC bylaw, if you were imposing industrial development charges, the Act does not yet allow you to impose those charges if an industrial building is only expanding its existing building, and it's only doing so up to 50% of its existing floor area, right? If it was expanding greater than that, you could impose it on the increment greater than the 50% increase, but the first 50% of that increase would be exempt. Also, if you are developing a facility or the county is developing a facility in your town, they would be exempt from payment of DCs, and similarly, if a school board was developing a building or a facility in your town, they would be exempt as well. And then lastly, under the Act, another statutory exemption that is required is that if you have an existing single-family home today, you're entitled to add up to 2 additional units within that house, and DCs would not be payable. So in essence, they could convert from a single-family home to a triplex, and you could not impose DCs on the 2 additional units. They could add a basement apartment, for example. A DC would not be eligible to be imposed on that basement apartment. So those are the statutory exemptions. And then in terms of the non-statutory exemptions, these are the ones that council has discretion over. And so these include more of a recognition of your practice, that if you have a temporary building or structure, as long as it's only in place up to 8 months, that you would not impose a DC on that, because it would not have a permanent demand for service. And then the other exemption that you have, which is fairly common, is not to impose development charges on non-residential farm buildings. So typically these are things like barns and silos, for example. It's fairly common that they're exempt in DC bylaws.
That's in the, and Les, you might correct me on this, but I believe what I'm saying is probably our current practice. We sometimes have a organization coming to us, say, a ski club, for example, and they're asking for us to waive development charges. And I believe that what we presently do is council finds that money somewhere because we can't really waive the development charge. Is that right? And that would continue under this future bylaw.
Yeah, so again, because that's not necessarily a policy in the bylaw, right? That's something that council is doing outside of the jurisdiction of the bylaw. So in essence, they would still pay the DC. They might receive funds that may offset those DC payments. So on a net basis, they're not impacted, but the DC would still be imposed and collected, either if it was funded from the town or from the developer directly. And then lastly, the one we've talked about a few times, and this is the redevelopment credit. So we've talked about the bylaw needing to reflect that some of this new development will occur as a result of redevelopment, either through a demolition and subsequent redevelopment or through a conversion. And so, as we've mentioned, the policy today allows for that redevelopment credit to be witnessed as long as the subsequent redevelopment occurs within 5 years of the demolition. Also, what we've done is to clarify the municipality's practice, and that is, if there was a demolition resulting from a natural hazard or a fire, that would form the date of the demolition, and they would have 5 years from that point in time to redevelop. And so that concludes the presentation. In terms of next steps then is for council to hear from the public on the presentation and the background study. For council to give consideration to what you may hear from the public in that regard. And then if there's any required changes or amendments, then those would be made, and that amended bylaw would come forward to council on July 30th for you to adopt, and then to consider to continue to charge these rates for the next 5 years. That concludes my presentation.
Yes.
I'd just like to compliment you on the clarity of your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just back to that 5-year rule, nothing about it being the same owner.
No, it stays with the land.
Stays with
So
the
yeah,
land.
so the
Okay.
ownership could change.
Great, thank you.
If I could follow up to Deputy Mayor's question, I think this is the time council maybe should make a decision whether you want to keep it within the 5 or change that policy. And that way we can bring a bylaw reflecting whatever council decides today.
Well, as I heard it explained, because we reset every 5 years and our consultant looks at the demand, I mean, if something was vacant for 5 years and you set the rate about future demands for infrastructure, and then someone comes along and builds that house, that is going to trigger an increased demand, right? I mean, I guess there can be hard cases and exceptions, but if the land's been vacant, there's been no demand on our roads or our schools or anything else for 5 years, I'm quite happy to stick with the explanation that was given to us.
I think what Freddie said is fair, but it goes back to my question about double dipping. If we have at some point in the past collected for that structure that is no longer there, and we've had the benefit of that money at the time, albeit at less money than it would be eligible for today. I think there's some unfairness in that. Now, there's a lot of properties in Mono where development charges were not levied, like my original house, which was built in 1855. But in this instance, I can't tell you whether or not a development charge was payable on this particular property. If it was, I would have some difficulty. If it wasn't, I would not have any difficulty in collecting it now.
I just hate to make a decision on something when we know that we have this particular issue in front of us, so to speak. At some point, we're going to have to make an exemption or decision on that particular issue if it comes forward. I'd like to look at it in terms of what, if we're not going to leave it the way it is now, what adjustments are we looking at doing? Because when did we start charging development charges?
Original came in 92, 93.
I didn't think we have the option of making an exemption once the bylaw's passed. There it is, right?
So that's why I agree with you. I'm fine with the 5-year rule. If we just continue to maintain that, if it does trigger some problems with individuals, I guess we have to deal with that on an ad hoc basis, maybe.
Through the appeal process.
Yeah.
We have an option to.
There is an appeal process.
But the problem with the appeal process is if we waive, we've got to make up that, money. And while I can see us doing that on a worthy organization, and that example has been raised, I would have some difficulty doing that for a resident or a business. So my approach, frankly, would be if the structure is replacing a structure that paid a development charge sometime from 93 forward, that we don't double dip. However, if it was a structure that predates development charges, then it should be subject to development charges. I don't know how we articulate that in our policy.
Yeah, so the way you would amend the bylaw in that regard is that you would remove your 5-year window, the 5-year limitation, and you would set the limitation as 1993. Right, so it would basically say that if anybody was redeveloping a site, as long as the demolition permit occurred after 1993, then you would be granting the credit on any subsequent redevelopment of those sites. So one of the things just to caution in that regard is being able to substantiate that.
I think we're talking about demolition
Yeah.
as it relates to natural disaster fire, not demolition
Yeah, and
because
it-
you wanted to demolish that building on your property.
Yeah, and again, council can make that distinction. So you could keep your 5-year rule for all demolitions, but if there's a demolition resulting from a fire or natural hazard, you could set that as being 1993.
Because it strikes me the 5 years is very arbitrary. That's just a figure that's been picked. But a more rational policy relates to whether or not development charges have been paid sometime in the past or not.
Yeah, I mean, the rationale behind the 5 years is just because even if, there was a DC paid on the site, right? If that site is now vacant, right, then those monies have either gone to pay for needs that were required up to that point in time, or they're still sitting in a reserve fund, right? And then those reserve fund monies and whatever's been constructed is being considered in light of the future developable lands, right? So it may be that if there was contributions that were made, those are already being either considered in the built infrastructure or the remaining reserve funds that set the pricing for the future obligations of new development, of this being one of those future developments, if that makes sense.
And to Mark's point, there would still be some credit calculation done vis-a-vis the original development charge versus the value of a development charge assessed today. In other words, they would be responsible for the difference, if I understood Mark's earlier point.
That was my question. Andrews was saying that 93 paid it at 93, it's a credit regardless of what you paid.
Yeah,
But it's a credit
Because
only,
you paid the equivalent DC at
it's
of the date.
only a credit to the extent of the 93 amount.
Yeah, so it seems to me that council has a few options, right? So the option is obviously stay the course with your current policy. Another option could be is that if the sympathy is with respect to not necessarily those that are demolishing and then just waiting a period of time and maybe land is transitioned over that and now somebody's going to redevelop and want a credit. If the sympathy is more for an existing homeowner who paid a DC that still occupies the land and their land had to be demolished because of a fire or natural hazard, them not having a limitation, then resetting for that circumstance to 1993 would prevent that from happening, right? So if what I'm hearing from council is, if there's an existing homeowner who's had to demolish because of a hazard, that, and they've paid a DC, meaning that they constructed after 1993, right? They should not have a DC obligation.
But you said earlier it goes with the land as
Yes.
opposed to the owner.
Exactly.
So a change in ownership shouldn't impact this. It really goes with the land. The other part of this equation that I think we have to take into consideration is the added assessment of the new construction. I mean, it's a whole lot better than the land sitting empty, vacant, and being taxed at a relatively low rate by comparison to somebody who then goes in and builds a house that then attracts more tax dollars. My point.
And that would sort of argue to have a shorter window, right? So these are commonly what municipalities are considering in developing and creating these types of redevelopment credits, right? Is that if what we want is not land sitting vacant for the purposes, because maybe it's underassessed, then by having a shorter window saying we'll provide you with credits only if you redevelop within a 3-year or 5-year period, then you're limiting the time that it's going to sit as vacant land and promoting more quick redevelopment, right? So, yeah. So again, I think if it's specifically that, you know, council's generally happy with the policy today, but wants to have an exception that if somebody has to demolish and redevelop because of a natural hazard, then you could have a section to that policy that says, in the case of that circumstance, the credit would be witnessed as long as that demolition had occurred after 1993. So again, pause.
Just as a caution, I know you're focused on the one that you have before you, which is a residential-related one. And I think most of the residential fires that we see, people want to get back in their house really quick. Just so council is aware, I can think of off the top of my head, just in the last minute, of at least 2 commercial properties destroyed by fire that haven't redeveloped in the last 10 or 20 years. So you are going to get caught on those as well, and those could be significant charges.
Well, it's become much more convoluted than what we originally started out with, and I hate to make a knee-jerk reaction saying we're going to do this, this, and this without having some time to reflect on the implications of our final decision. Because yes, our CEO is right. I mean, I think we're all sort of thinking about one particular situation before us, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we haven't opened Pandora's box and we lose DCs on a variety of different areas, because you know, if DCs are paid on the actual property itself, to me, there's probably a lot more properties that have been vacant or the house has fallen down or whatever, and then, you know, so the whole idea of collecting the DCs is supposed to be for current and future needs. And so I don't want to lose that opportunity. So I don't know how the rest of council feels. Okay, could you say that louder?
Leave it alone.
Okay.
Leave it the way it is, I think. There are a lot of implications here, and I think that the cleanest thing is to leave it the way it is.
Okay, Sharon, do you have any comments that you want to make?
So are we still talking about in 1993, if DC charges were paid? We're not even involving that at all?
Well, this is the item that's for
Yeah.
discussion.
Yeah. So, okay, so I pretty much know this property, and I'd say they didn't pay DC charges. Pretty sure. It was built before that. So I think I have to say leave it.
Okay. And then, under our bylaw, even though it's only in place for 5 years, if a situation arises, what is council's opportunities if there is a problem to try and correct an error in judgment? Are we allowed to amend the bylaw within that 5-year period?
Yes, so council can amend the bylaw at any time.
Okay.
So, but just to clarify, if you're amending the bylaw, do you have to update your study again, though?
You have to have a background study and hold a public meeting, so you have to go through the same statutory process. But if it was, for example, just to change a policy, the background study would be relatively small. It would be more like a staff report.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do you feel now?
How do I feel now? I'm reluctantly of the view that it should be left alone, in particular because of the impact on the commercial industrial. I mean, I'm worried about that because I can think of some properties that may also not have paid a development charge because they were fairly old and I think predate 93. But we do have an appeal process, and I think people are entitled to make that appeal, and we also have the opportunity to reopen our policy subject to what you've just told us.
Okay, so I think we have agreement then that we will leave it as is and deal with things as they come. So, if there's nothing further, we don't have anybody in attendance to hear input. So if there's nothing further, we need a resolution to close the public meeting and resume the regular meeting of council. Moved by Martin and seconded by Nix. Are we okay? All in favor? Carries? So having heard comments, this public meeting is now closed. Council will urge the public to submit their comments in writing prior to July 24th, 2019. Council consideration of the development charge bylaw is scheduled to occur during the regular session of council on July 30th, 2019 at 9 a.m. So there is no further business on the agenda. We will close off the Town of Mono Development Charges background study prepared by Watson and Associates Economics Ltd. dated May 31st, 2019 be approved, and that the proposed growth-related capital programs are contained in the study that have been used in the calculation of the development charge rates to be approved. So could I have a mover? Moved by Mantelo and seconded by Krillman. All in favor? That carries. And that we introduce and give the necessary readings to a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of the Council of the Town of Mono in Session 13-2019 held on July 12, 2019, that it be signed by the Mayor and the Clerk and sealed and engrossed in the bylaw book. Moved by Nix and seconded by Martin. All in favor? Carries. And we adjourn this meeting at 10:21 a.m. Moved by Magtalo and seconded by Creelman. All in favor? Carries. Thank you very much, everybody.